But he comes and he gives himself in a way that's so meaningful that they take that into the world around them. One of the things that's amazing as we look at this meal with Jesus and other meals that Jesus had with people is that as he sat down, he was able to speak into the lives of everyone that he sat down with. He was able to take time and listen and take time to pour into people. And that happens here at the table in communion, but it happens in other meals as well. Unshakable truths. That's what we're starting out this year and looking at different elements of our faith that are unspeakable truths. And we've spent the last 3 weeks looking at communion. And this weekend we're blessed to be able to serve communion in all of our services. And so if you're a regular attender here, please don't let that throw you off. We'll be on our regular routine starting next week. But as we think about unshakable truths, we've talked about how Passover meal and communion are connected and how Jesus sat with his disciples. We've looked at all of the Passover accounts in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke and today in Mark. And I want to go beyond that, and I want to look into that Acts reading that we had as well. And here's the unshakable truth that I want to kind of talk through a little bit today. And that is that as we regularly break bread together, have communion together, it helps us stay connected to Jesus and others. Our mission statement as a church is to be connected to Jesus and others. And so breaking of bread, of having communion, helps us do that and stay connected. And what does that look like in our lives? Well, I think we might need to talk about what it doesn't look like at sometimes, right? So one of the things that Pastor Goff talked about last week is that we have these two relationships that we live in, or two kingdoms, if you look into like Martin Luther and how he talks about them. We have this kingdom of a vertical nature where we know that God comes to us. He comes to us in Jesus, and his grace covers us. But we also have this horizontal kingdom that we live in, and that is us living in community together, right? Sometimes for some of us, that can take precedence, and we forget that we are covered in God's grace. I have a friend, his name's John, and this happened to John in his life. He was in the finance world, and he started as an intern. And over time, in a year, he became a manager, and in that came more and more responsibilities. That meant more and more time away from his family, more and more time where he was dedicated just to getting ahead. And eventually, he forgot about all of the other stuff that was a part of his life. And he was just concentrated on what was next. What's that next big thing? That cost him all he had, because as he did that, he forgot what grace was in his life. He forgot what it looked like to be forgiven and to forgive those around him. And as he forgot that, he lost his family. He ended up losing that awesome job he had. And eventually, he found his way to sitting at a table with me, and we began to talk about what grace looked like. And he began to remember what it looked like to be connected to God. And he needed some help in remembering that. And so we talked about what that looked like to be a part of the body of believers once again. And he's not the only one. Sometimes in our lives, we get so focused on what's in front of us or the relationships that are connected to us that we forget that we are covered in God's grace. I think as Jesus is sitting down with his disciples, he recognizes that we might have a tendency to do that. And so he gives something special to his disciples and in turn to us to help us in those moments where we may forget what it is like to be covered in grace. And that is, he gives himself to us, right? So Jesus, as he's sitting with his disciples and they've had their Passover meal, he begins to change the story. Change the story from not what is and are you good enough and have you done all of the right things, but to a story of it's about being connected to me and the grace that I am giving you. I have come for you, and so as you partake in this meal, it is me for you. And as he sits there with his disciples, he knows they're not perfect. He knows who's sitting around the table. He knows that they have trouble with the two kingdoms. But he comes and he gives himself in a way that's so meaningful that they take that into the world around them. One of the things that's amazing as we look at this meal with Jesus and other meals that Jesus had with people is that as he sat down, he was able to speak into the lives of everyone that he sat down with. He was able to take time and listen and take time to pour into people. And that happens here at the table in communion, but it happens in other meals as well. And so one of the things that we looked at a couple weeks ago was this quote from Tim Chester. And I want to just say this, that this is one of the ways that we do live on mission. There's several. There's lots of ways that we live on mission. But as we sit down and have meals together, we're living on mission. And that happens in our homes, but it also happens around the table. Because as we come up for communion, we can look to our right and look to our left, and we see people who are different than us. But at the same time, they are covered in God's grace just like we are. Right? We come not as perfect people, but as people who need to know how much we are loved and we are forgiven and that there's a hope for tomorrow. And as we fast forward the story from Mark or Luke, we look at what that meant for the early church, right? And so the book of Acts is an account of what took place in the early church. And one of the first things that we come across is this verse in chapter 2 and verse 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. They devoted themselves. They committed to this. You see, it was a part of their regular routines to do these things so that as they met together, they knew that they were connected to Jesus, and they knew what that meant for them. And so let's take a little bit of a look at what they committed to. They committed to the apostles' teaching. It means that they committed themselves to learning about who Jesus is and what he had done for them. Right? At this point, it's an oral tradition. They're sharing the stories. They are taking the time to learn and to hear what Jesus had done while he was on earth. They're taking time to learn about his death and his resurrection and the hope that that brings. And with that, they were doing it together, right? So the Greek word for fellowship here is one that a lot of our high schoolers will recognize as koinonia. It's a coming together of the body of believers. It's the ability for us to look and see the people around us and know that they are covered by God's grace. And then the question is, how do we know that they're covered by God's grace? Because they take part in the means of grace, right? That's one of the ways that Luther looked at communion or the breaking of bread. It's this idea that God's grace comes to us in this meal so that we know, that we don't have to guess, but we know that he's here for us and his love and his forgiveness cover us in this meal. Not only us, but those who are with us. And so we're able to see how we're a part of this community, this body of believers, as we come regularly to break bread together. And one of the things that I know happens to me sometimes, and I think it happens to other people, is I have the head knowledge of what it means that God has come and he has forgiven me. But at times I don't feel it. Like Luther says, to steadfastly feel it, right? Sometimes that isn't where I stand. I just have the head knowledge. But in communion, what God is doing is he's coming to us in a real way to help us connect the head and the heart, that feeling, so that we will know that we are forgiven. We know that the people around us are a part of a body that's bigger than we are. And so that as we come together and we regularly break bread together, as we regularly commune together, it helps us stay connected to Jesus because we know and it forms us, and to others because we can see how the body of believers is connected through this special gift that God has given. So my hope is that as you come up for communion today, that it really does help you stay connected to Jesus and to others. And that as you go through the rest of this year, that if it is something that you find yourself missing, that you're able to find a way to be in regular breaking of bread, a regular habit or life of breaking bread together, of having communion, and being connected to Jesus and to others. And I'm going to stop right here and talk to those online. And if this is you and you haven't been in for a while, contact us, and we'd love to commune and bring communion to you. We know that it's an important part of the life of the church and of our life together. And so as we go on in worship, just know that this is a part of our regular habits as we regularly break bread together to stay connected to Jesus and others. Amen.